Next June, Heinz will end more than a century of tomato processing when it closes its Leamington, Ontario plant. More than 700 workers will be affected by the closure, and that doesn't take into account the hit the province's agricultural industry. Farmers, suppliers, and seasonal workers will all take. Joining us now for more on the closure, here's Andreas Boecker. He is professor in the Department of Food, Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of Guelph, and we thank you very much for what shouldn't be, but was a 2-hour drive for you to leave Guelph and get to our studios today. So thanks very much for making the effort.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
I want to start by having you tell us, in your view, why Heinz decided to close its plant in Leamington.
Well, that's a not so easy question to answer because they have been very tight-lipped about the reasons for closing the plant. But we have to look at two different levels of decision-making or that influence the decision. The first one is, let's say, global developments or the larger economic developments. And the second one is the current situation of the plant, whether it needed upgrades, how productive and efficient the plant was. And what certainly played a role was the exchange rate, which is not playing to the favor of Canadian manufacturing in general.
Okay, let's pick these three apart if we can then. Yeah. Global developments. What's happening around the world right now that might have been influential on that plant?
It's increasing global connections and trade. And one trend that we might see is that food manufacturers focus their activities on brand development, being more flexible, trying to be more flexible in production, and being also forced to be more efficient and productive so that they can compete. And that certainly had an impact because what I heard was that there's overcapacity in tomato processing within the Heinz corporation.
Too much supply, not enough demand.
Too much processing capacity.
They're making too much of the stuff.
They could make more than they can sell, and that adds to the cost they have to look after, and that's probably a very important factor in closing the Heinz plant.
Okay, the plant itself, was there anything particularly out of date or antiquated or not up to scratch with the plant?
So I don't have this inside information. What I have heard is that there haven't been any major investments in the past years, and there was also talk that a food safety related upgrade was needed, costing into the millions. So that would need to be confirmed. But those might be factors that have influenced the decision against Leamington.
You mentioned the third thing, which was the exchange rate, but the Canadian dollar and the American dollar have been so close to one another for a long time right now. So why would the currency rate be significant today as opposed to a year ago or 2 or 3 or 4 for that matter? Well,
that's you have to take a long-term perspective, and for the new owners of Heinz, so it's the Warren Buffett's investment company and a Brazilian investor, they might have made the decision, or they might have come to the conclusion that the exchange rate will stay as it is on par, and that possibly the previous management had thought otherwise, that it might come back in a different way. But it's, once again, we don't have the insights into the right decision.
Presumably it goes without saying that if the dollar were at 68 cents US again, as it was 25 years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation tonight.
Fairly likely. Yeah.
Fairly likely. Yeah. 3 weeks before the Leamington announcement, McDonald's announced that it was ending its 40-year relationship with Heinz. Do you think that had anything to do with what transpired in southwestern Ontario?
I think it's, if at all, it's a minor factor. The amount of, let's say, produce or product that Heinz supplied to McDonald's in Canada was fairly limited. So if you do a quick calculation, there are 1,400 McDonald's stores. If they consume 10 tons of ketchup a year, which I think they don't, so that would be 14,000 tons out of 200,000 tons of tomato ketchup equivalent. Heinz produces. So that should not be the driving factor.
That's a good chunk, though. It's a good chunk of your business.
It's not trivial,
insignificant.
but it's not such a big blow that it would be decisive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Andreas, they've got this plant now. This plant is going to be empty next year. What do you do with it?
Well, it's first and foremost Heinz decision. If they decide to sell it because it's geared towards Heinz products in the manufacturing equipment, they would invite a competitor to produce. And even if the competitor would get this plant at a fairly, at a lucrative price, the major step is, however, to get the product on the shelves in the supermarkets. And that's where Heinz is a very dominant player in the Canadian market.
How likely is it, though, that Heinz is going to sell one of its plants to one of its competitors?
I would say unlikely.
Unlikely?
Yes.
How about nil?
Well, that's, strictly speaking, there's no probability of nil, but we can get very close to that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
How about the options for the farmers? What do they do now?
Well, there's limited options, especially in the short run. So for next year, a number of farmers have already prepared the fields and have possibly made investment in new equipment. And for them, what I heard is that they are in negotiations with Heinz for compensation, but that's impossible to predict what the outcome of that is. Short term, there might be possibilities to have for a little bit of the production quantity or for the growers to have contracts with the other processors in the area, possibly other processing vegetables, but that's fairly limited.
That's what I want. I mean, you know, you're the food guy. You know the food situation. So if you can't grow tomatoes because there's no market for your tomatoes, what's the next logical thing you could convert to without going massively into debt to buy new equipment, plants, and so on?
So the least cost and least risk option would be to go into the grains and oilseeds, or it would be in Ontario it's corn and soybeans, because there's an international market for that. And there's also, the growing conditions and the soil quality is made for that in southern Ontario. But it's not, it doesn't salvage the equipment that they have invested in. So the tomato equipment can basically only be used for tomatoes.
So do they sell that to someone else?
I don't know. It's going to have a very low value. That's the problem with it. Yeah.
So anybody who's in farming in southwestern Ontario in the tomato business in the next 6 months or so is looking at taking a pretty significant hit to their business. Do these people have a future?
Well, they're entrepreneurs. They will be looking for opportunities to get out of this crisis. Since it's only been, so I've been able to talk to a couple of them, they are confident that they will develop something to deal with the crisis. But it's certainly, it's a very difficult time. Yeah.
Can you sue Heinz at this point? Is there any point in doing that?
As I was told, the contracts are set up in such a way that they don't get into contracts about exact quantities with the farmers. It's a share in the processing volume. So legally, they're on the safe side now because the growers have a share of X% in zero processing. So that's no way for them except for the compensation for investments that have been made based on information that there would be contracts.
Now, presumably these folks are expert at the tomato business, not the grains and oilseeds business. So if they do convert their lands over to that, do they know that there are markets for those crops if they choose to grow them?
Yes, the grains, corn and soybeans, there's an international market for that. Those commodities are traded internationally and the price is not determined in Canada. So, and the acreage is that would need to be converted to these commodities is not large enough to make an impact on the world market price. Now,
we're talking about more than 700 jobs in a community the size of Leamington, this is a small town.
Yes.
This would be the equivalent of tens of thousands of layoffs in Toronto. I mean, we're looking at, for a small area, a huge, huge economic hit. What does the town do at this point? I mean, this is presumably a lot of property tax revenue that they will no longer realize now. What kind of a hit are they looking at?
That's, to be honest, a little bit of outside of the research that we do, but it's that's going to be, I think, the toughest question or the toughest situation to solve, because contrary to the farmers who are entrepreneurs who have been looking into all sorts of changes over the past 10, 20 years and have adapted to them very successfully, so that they are competitive with the huge growers in California and in the Midwest of the US, processing facilities. So that's going to be a lot harder to find employment for the workforce.
Can you imagine that there will be some farmers who will just say, you know what, I'm 55, I'm near the end of the run anyway, I'm just walking away. That's it, shutting it down, giving it all away, end of story?
Could very well happen if there's no successor to the farm. That's a possibility. And but for that I would have to know a little bit more the 45 or 46 processors who've been growers who've been affected by the shutdown.
There is a tendency when something like this happens to portray the company that is closing down, which is usually a multinational, as the bad guy. Do you think Heinz is the bad guy in this story?
Well, the bad guy sort of implies they are the ones to blame, and it's really not. I mean, I as an economist would prefer to think in terms of cause and effect, and it is a decision that the new ownership made and the new management made, and apparently the development within Heinz or at Heinz in the past years has led to that situation that they had overcapacity, and the previous management was not able to deal with that situation effectively. From that perspective, it's a business decision.
I mean, it's not like they're picking on Canada. They're shutting down a couple of plants in the United States as well, right?
Yes, and they have done so before. What we know pretty much for sure is that the growers who've provided their produce to Heinz, they have been competitive. Their prices have been tied to exchange rates and domestic or freight rates within the U.S. So it's not a decision against Canada or Leamington. It is a very straightforward business decision.
Straightforward business decision, but that if you live there and
Yes,
if you depended on that, that's not much consolation, right?
Not at all. Because there's so much more than the business value of the plant or the salvage value that has been generated over the generations there. Yeah.
I would like your view on what you believe the political response from either the government of Ontario or the government of Canada, what you think that's been in this case.
So quite obviously the policy was not, or government was not involved in any prior talks to the decision before that was made public. So government was taken by surprise too. In terms of a response, there's, I think, because Heinz was very clear about that they would not negotiate reopening or changing their plans. There's very little government can do in terms of anything related to keeping the plant open. What they can do is provide maybe bridging loans or
tax breaks, subsidies?
Tax breaks, subsidies for a transition period, which would certainly help a lot of the farmers. Because if they had invested in equipment, then what they have to pay to pay back their loans, if they get a break on that, that would certainly give them more time to recover.
But presumably, if that's going to happen, you'd have to know ahead of time that this was a possibility. And given that everybody was caught off guard by this, I guess that's the next question. Should they have been surprised at this? Because clearly everybody seems to have been caught, as the expression goes, with their pants down here.
I've heard that as late as April, Heinz management had confirmed that there will be contracts for the Ontario, for the producers in the area. So now it now boils down to the question, would government have any more accurate information than what management reveals publicly? I don't think so, because when the new ownership and the new management made all the analysis to prepare their decision, they didn't share that information with anybody. So it's difficult. You can think long term and say, what are the conditions in terms of labor regulation, energy cost, everything else that might affect the productivity of the plant or the profitability of a plant. But that's long-term thinking. That is not related to this particular case.
I'm not trying to make trouble here, but when you're the Premier who's also the Agriculture Minister, yes, and the agricultural sector takes a hit like this, you know, there are going to be people asking questions about, shouldn't you have known something was a possibility and therefore been in there to try to prevent it before it happened? Is that a legitimate question?
It's asking a bit much of government.
Think so?
Yes, because that would also mean that they would have to know about they should have known about plant closures by other companies, smaller companies, because they add up to similar effects that we now see with the Leamington crisis. Yeah.
So we are where we are. What do they do now?
Well, there's also, well, you could say some good news, because other processors in that area have invested heavily and they have been able to pay competitive prices to get the raw material base that they need. I was told that Bonduelle, so the French-based processor, has made major investments in Ontario and Quebec. There's other processors that have made decisions to get into the to get started in the province, like Oetker from Germany. And I've heard of plans to establish hazelnut production for Ferrero in Ontario. So it's not only bad news, but there's certainly potential. I think we have a very competitive and productive, let's say, natural resource base in terms of agricultural production here in Ontario. Well,
again, we'll keep our fingers crossed on that. And that Ferrero stuff tastes good. So, okay, let's hope you're right about that. Andreas Boecker, thank you so much for coming in tonight and helping us understand this a bit better.
Thank you for having me.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.